Right, hello guys, hobby video today, and I'm going to be looking at something called Mr. Hobby Surfacer 500 and Mr. Hobby Dissolved Putty. I've been really enjoying this brand since I discovered it a little while ago, and what these are today, these are for filling in mold lines and so on. Now, that could be considered a slightly advanced thing depending on where you are, but it really isn't, and you shouldn't be scared of doing anything like this. Now, what these are basically liquid fillers, okay? And you get different kinds of fillers. You can get masonry fillers, you can obviously get kind of putty, like green stuff, and they used to be the liquid green stuff, which I'm not sure if they still do. Vallejo do a sort of liquid putty as well, liquid mold filling line. Now this stuff is basically paintable filler, and you get with the Mr. Surfacer you actually get different grades. This is 500, the heaviest, and you can also get 1000 and 1200, which are much finer, much more dilute, I guess. Now what these are for, as I say, is for filling in things like air bubbles, damage when they've been taken out of a mold, or with the more Citadel stuff, mold lines. You don't tend to get sort of damage to the models and so on with the Citadel. That tends to be more like Forge World. So today I'm going to show you how to use these right through from start to finish and show you all the processes in there. Now to create an appropriate gap, I'm just using some sprue, and I'm going to be using this glue that I've always used since I was a kid. This super glue is called Zappa Gap, bonds skin and eyes in seconds. Be careful with this stuff. This is very, very sticky super glue. There's a couple of different grades with this as well, which you can actually use for filling in mold lines as well. There's a slightly sort of thinner super glue, but I did find that stuff as a kid just goes everywhere. So I've cut these pieces of sprue, just glued them together there, so that we've got essentially what would be like a large mold line gap. Now I will say on both of these pieces today, the damage that I've done to them is more severe than I would use normally with either of these liquid fillers. And also on this first piece here, this piece of sprue, this is a Forge World piece of sprue, that's why it's a slightly different colour. Now also with this, like I say, the damage is so severe that normally what I would do is put a piece of green stuff that's like putty, and I would get this into those larger spaces and file it down before I apply the Mr. Surfacer. However, for the purposes of this, I just thought I would do it entirely with the Mr. Surfacer to show you kind of how it goes. And as we go along, I'm just layering it up more and more, drying it off in between each stage with a hairdryer. Normally you wouldn't need to apply so much, it's just because this has got very heavy damage on there. So we'll let that dry off a little bit and we'll go over to the Mr. Hobby Liquid Putty, okay? Now this is for finer stuff like mold lines. I'm going to generally use this on more like Citadel miniatures. The Surfacer is for maybe vehicles or larger models or finer stuff with Forge World, things like this. And again, same process, just layering it up more and more. Every time you dry this kind of stuff off, whether it's this or the Surfacer, it's going to have some shrinkage. Okay, so that means that as you lay it onto the line and you dry it, it's going to shrink into that line, which means usually that's why you need to layer a few up. Another thing to keep in mind, do not use a good brush. Don't use a high quality, expensive brush. Use a crappy brush, usually with artificial bristles. I'm just cleaning it off here with some cellulose thinners. Now after you feel that's been layered up enough over the area, we're going to start to sand into it. Now I'm just using a standard just little emery board here, and different emery boards, they often start off actually quite abrasive because it's essentially sandpaper on a stick. If you have some sandpaper of different grades, if you want to be finicky, then you can go for that. And I do use some very fine grade wet and dry paper later with this. But essentially an emery board for most of the time is fine, as long as you don't go too crazy. And again, I often find that mine sort of wear down very quickly over time anyway. Now after a first section of sanding here, we can take a little look and you can see that on the right hand side, this is where there was less damage, but there were those large holes. But you can see that it's filled in very well. But on the left hand side here, where there was more damage, I'm having a hard time filling this because of that large gap there. Now part of the reason, as I say, ordinarily I would apply some green stuff and sand it off, but today we're just using this. So it's not ideal, but I just wanted to do this for a demonstration to kind of show the difference, okay? Now with this, the other thing is that I'm doing this quite quickly today just to show and do a bit of a tutorial. Normally you might leave this for an hour or so to really dry and harden and cure, but I'm just doing it quickly with a hairdryer in between. You can imagine if you took your time a little bit more than I do, you're going to get a greater effect. And also, like I say, it's not so thick most of the time when you're doing this anyway. Now we're back to the other one, the Mr. Dissolved Putty for the finer lines for kind of Citadel and stuff like this, and this is where we got to with it. It needs another little layer. You can see at the top there's a little chink still that's visible, so I've applied another layer. Now after I'd sanded that back a little more, I decided that it did need something just to fill in the recess a little bit more. Now I could have just reapplied some of the putty, but I thought it'd be good to actually try some of the Zappa Gap super glue, which as I say I've used in the past, and we'll come back to this when it's dried off. Okay, now back to the other sprue, which we were leaving to harden up and cure a little more after I'd reapplied several layers of the Mr. Surfacer. So now we're going to go back in and we're just going to sand this back again. Now when you're sanding, you do want to be quite careful, you do want to be quite gentle, because what you don't want to do is go too hard on one area of the model or the sprue, because if you do that, you can end up with an uneven surface, and that's usually not what you want. Especially, I'm doing this on a flat surface, which is not too tricky, but if you're doing it on a curved surface, you're going to need to really control how much pressure you're applying. Otherwise, you're going to end up in a situation where the model could even be deformed by you sanding, and that's absolutely not what you want. Now, I did the right-hand side, which was fairly smooth, and you can see that the Mr. Surfacer, because it's a filler, as I'm sanding, this is actually getting stuck into the sandpaper on the emery board. So again, you need to kind of maybe clear that off from time to time to make sure that you've still got a good abrasive surface. But you can see this is what happens, look, when you don't let it cure. You can see it's still not completely dry, and what I'm having to do is kind of push it back in, and then I dried it off with some heat a little bit more there as well, getting back into it, sanding it and sanding it. Now, as I say, I ended up with actually a reasonable finish on this, and if you had allowed it to cure and become properly hardened, then you're going to be able to sort of sand into it properly, and I probably wouldn't have ended up with the very small mark that you'll see at the end. But this is a very good product. I've been using it for a little while now, and if you ever have any surfaces, this tends to apply more to Forge World models when they're being taken out of the mold, and you get sort of kind of weird layering effects, I guess, with the resin. But you can see, look, after we've sanded this one back yet again, now on the right hand side it's actually looking very good now. You might see what looks like some texture here, but that's a bit of an illusion. It actually feels very smooth. Often this is just kind of how it looks. The sort of shadows there, they're not necessarily actually rough lines, it's kind of more just the coloration where the filler is getting into it. But nonetheless, it does need reapplying, so we're just going to lay some more of the surfacer back on here, and again, dry that off, build it up, build it up. As I say, this was, again, severe damage. Normally I would have gone perhaps with some ordinary green stuff or other kinds of harder, putty-like filler first, but for today I just wanted to get that on there. Now, this is the super glue that we're removing, okay, we're just filing back into it, and you know, super glue actually works fairly well as an improvised mold line filler, depending on what kind of super glue you have, if it will allow itself to kind of drip into those recesses. And if you were using a liquid cement, that can work quite well as well. Just give the model a little tap and allow that to fill into those lines, applying some pressure. So now the next application of the surfacer has dried off. We're going to go back in and sand this back down again. And again, being careful not to go too heavy. If you're using different grades of sandpaper or emery board or whatever, you're obviously going to start with the harder and work down to the finer grade. But again, you really don't need anything too heavy duty for miniatures. And then just for a finishing touch here, I'm going in with some wet and dry paper. Again, you can pick this up from almost anywhere. You can see it's still taking material off of this. You can pick this up from a hardware shop or anything like this. It's very easy to get hold of. Get it from Amazon if you want to. Now, I wouldn't usually use this stuff on every model, but I might do for a character or maybe a vehicle even, if it was something I really was enjoying and I wanted to look very good, very clean indeed. Or if you had to work over, say, an especially rough piece of surface. For example, I was recently working on a Castigator Knight, and again, some of the appendages and so on can be very rough, and they need this kind of smoothing down with this grade, because you will not be able to achieve it with a harder sandpaper. And again, that's where the surfacer can come in, because even if there doesn't appear to be too many scratches, you can be surprised how that stuff will pick it up. But now we've gotten down to a pretty clean grade here, just for the purposes of this tutorial. I mean, essentially, all I'm trying to do today is show you guys roughly what kind of effect you can get from this, and you would be able to understand that, you know, if you took a little bit more time and you really worked carefully with an area on a model that you wanted to get perfect, you're going to understand, you know, what you can kind of achieve. Now, here we are at the end. I've just basically primed these up with some Chaos Black rattle can spray primer, and you can see on the right hand side our little mold gap is very difficult to see now, and again, like you can see it there still, but we'll put some paint on in a moment, which will help to obscure. Now, this is the other one. Now, like I say, with this one, I did this very quickly today. If you wanted to and you spent more time, you could get a very 100% clean finish on here. But as I say, just for the purposes of illustrating what this stuff can do, you can see those larger holes on the right hand side. It can barely be seen, and again, across the whole thing, it's very much filled in. The left hand side is where it's failed a little bit more, and again, that's because I have not been allowing it the proper time it should have to cure, because I just wanted to put this process through for a tutorial. However, nonetheless, when we get some paint on here, you'll see how things are going to change pretty quickly. Because even when you do have some of these rough little marks and so on, once you begin to apply layers of paint, and again, I was doing this with a brush today, I would have used my airbrush, but setting up the entire airbrush and getting it all ready just for the purposes of priming and colouring this up was a little bit much for me, so I thought I would do this with a brush, and then also you get to see how you can kind of layer paint up with a brush, and it's, you know, very easy to do. So again, all I'm doing is applying thin layers here, drying it off with a hairdryer in between, then coming back, doing another layer, drying it off, coming back, doing another layer, and you're just building up a base layer. Now the colours I'm using for this, just if you wanted to know, I was using a base of Thousand Suns blue and then finishing up with a layer of Araman blue. And again, as I say, this is just for the purposes of showing you what it looks like once you've got colour applied. And you can remember that there's a fair few little marks in the middle area of this piece, and as we put the colour on, you'll see that those marks start to basically disappear. And this is with me having done this very, very quickly today. And you remember on the right hand side we had those very large holes, we had a lot of distress, there were some fine lines to the very far right. On the left hand side I had really scratched the model and dug in and used a scalpel to kind of destroy that area, and you can see that, as I say, it has basically removed all of that distress and come back to a very nice smooth finish. So even if you had a model that was very damaged, or for example maybe you bought a model from eBay and it needed a lot of tuning up and repair and so on, you can get some, or if you have some old models yourself stashed at home, if they're really badly damaged, it doesn't mean that you can't salvage it. Now here I thought it would be useful to actually put this up against a model that I'm currently working on, because sometimes when you look at this stuff up very, very close, it ends up looking worse than it actually is. So looking at distance here, you can see that against the model, it's actually a very clean surface, and like I say, it's only that left hand side with that very large area dug out that I was unable to properly fill because I wasn't allowing it the curing time where you can see. So it ends up being a very, very nice clean finish. So now we'll come over to the other one. This was the sort of more standard Citadel mold gap, but even this one was a big gap. Most of the time on the models, the mold lines, they can be very fine. Only this sort of severe line you would get on maybe a gun barrel or something like this. Now here's the two side by side just to finish. And again, I haven't color corrected this or added any crazy bright colors because I wanted you to see it just as it is when I've finished. And you can see on the right hand side, again, a distance, very, very clean indeed. You wouldn't know that the large hole was gouged out. But if you look at the bottom there, you can see there is still a little mark, and that gives you an idea of just how much it's filled and how clean it looks. So that's it for today, guys. Mr. Surfacer Hobby 500 and Mr. Dissolved Putty both work incredibly well for finishing and detailing your models, mold lines, fixing repairs, and so on and so on. If you have enjoyed this video today, guys, please drop a like. Tell me what you think. If you have any questions, drop them down in the comments. I'm usually around for an hour or two once I've posted a video up. And as per usual, always, if you are working with solvents, if you're working with chemicals, if you're doing anything indoors which is model related, make sure it's well ventilated, make sure you've got proper eyewear. You don't want to be flicking thinners into your eye or anything like this. So that's it. Thanks very much indeed, guys. I will see you in the next one.